Good evening and welcome to our ReggieCon panel discussing Ghost River by Dr. Lee Francis IV. We are thrilled to have you join us for our second year of ReggieCon at Illinois State University and our third ReggieCon panel of the 2021-22 year. My name is Amelia Noel Elkins and I am the Interim Assistant Vice President for Student Success at Illinois State. We are thrilled tonight to join in the celebration of Native American History Month through this conversation. Before we begin the panel, just a few details to keep everything running smoothly for all of you in the audience. Please know that this session is being recorded and it will be archived on the ReggieCon website. Also, if you need confirmation that you attended tonight's ReggieCon event, we will post a link to a form for you to submit a request for a confirmation of attendance. While the presenters' video and audio are on, we cannot hear or see any guests. However, we will be monitoring the Q&A function, so we encourage you to ask questions of the presenters. After some initial discussion, our panelists will be taking questions from the audience. Please visit the ReggieCon website at illinoisstate.edu/ReggieCon to find ReggieCon merchandise. A portion of the proceeds from the ReggieCon merchandise sales will be donated to the Red and White Fund to benefit Illinois State students in financial need. Also at the ReggieCon website, you can find recordings of previous panels and information about the ReggieCon panels for the remainder of the 2021-22 academic year. Our hope is that in the spring, we'll be able to host a live event for ReggieCon. Keep checking the website for updates. At this time, I am pleased to introduce our moderator and panelist for this discussion of Ghost River, Dr. Scott Jordan, who is the professor and chair of psychology here at Illinois State. Scott, I will hand it off to you.
Thank you, Dr. Noel Elkins, and welcome everyone to ReggieCon, the con that asks the question, what's your story? I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty, cognitive psychologist, philosopher here at Illinois State University. And before we begin, I just want to take a moment to thank the people that actually make us look like we know what we're doing here in the Zoom room. Dr. Amelia Noel Elkins, whom you've met, Dr. Janet Albrecht, Mr. Sean Thornton, who does all the amazing artwork for our flyers, Miss Danny Schroeder, and Miss Somer Simmons. Thanks to all of you for making us look good. So tonight we come together to celebrate Native American Heritage Month with a discussion of Dr. Lee Francis IV's amazing graphic novel, Ghost River. Joining me on the ReggieCon crew to discuss this fantastic piece of work is the one, the only Dr. Teresa Rojas. Teresa, please come on in, turn your camera and your mic on and say something about who you are, and then say a little bit about what it felt like to read this amazing piece of work.
Yes, so I'm Dr. Teresa Rojas. I am professor of English and the first professor of ethnic studies at Modesto Junior College in the beautiful California Central Valley here. I am also the director of the Latinx Comic Arts Festival. We are planning to come back in person March 25th and 26th, 2022. So I'm very excited about that. And I'm really honored to be part of this month's panel, to be part of the panel that selected this book, because this is unlike anything that I've read before, and we don't have enough of these stories, number one. And number two, this is a really important moment, I think, for ReggieCon, for all of us to really come together in celebration of this just wonderful graphic novel. And this is one of those that I had to read multiple times. And every single time that I read it, I just was sort of pausing and just taking a moment to really soak up the gravity of what I was reading. So it's one of those things where you're enjoying reading the story, but then you really have to stop and just think for a moment and sort of recontextualize your brain. So I appreciate that so very much. So I'm very happy to be here.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And also on the ReggieCon crew, the hardest working man in the comics, Mr. Victor Daniels Jr. Victor, please tell the audience a little something about who you are and about the feels you got as you read this piece of work.
Oh my God, and feels I did receive. That is the truth. I'm Victor Dandridge, a self-publishing comic creator from Columbus, Ohio, through my imprint, Vantage and House Productions. I'm also a phenomenological narratologist, according to the ReggieCon crew, through my You Create Comics line, where I teach others how to create comics of their very own and understand the philosophies and ideals behind telling stories. I'm not gonna lie, this story made me uncomfortable in the best way possible by seeing a glimpse of dark history that has kind of permeated American culture in a way that is unfortunately forgotten by too many people and needs to be known by everyone. I saw this in a digital format, so I have to admit, I'll never, ever read the finite book, because the digital format with its extra inclusions of videos and things like that is such a phenomenal fourth wall experience. It may change how I make comics in the future. It was something that as I saw it, it gave such a very different inclusion and sense of engagement to the process behind the story itself, that it just became this total piece that I don't want to read it without that. And it was beautiful.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Victor. Also on the ReggieCon crew, my friend, colleague, and partner in crime and all things nerdy, the one, the only Dr. Eric Wesselman. Eric, please come on in, tell the audience a little something about who you are, as well as the feels you got while reading this amazing piece of work.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I'm Eric Wesselman. I'm a social psychologist here at Illinois State University. My primary research focuses on studying the dynamics of social inclusion and exclusion. I also enjoy using popular media like film and comics to teach psychological concepts. It's also a plus to just hang out with smart, groovy people and talk about fun things. You know, one of the cool things about being part of this crew is that we start to finish each other's sentences. Both Teresa and Victor have stole my thunder in terms of the feels that I got. I also had to read the book multiple times. I got the opportunity to read the book multiple times. And I really did enjoy as much as I love sort of physical, you know, sort of analog comics, there was this really fun multi sort of level experience of reading it once just to sort of get the story, then going back through and clicking on the footnotes, watching the videos, the maps, the documents. And so it was almost like this, you know, reading across multiple windows in my repeated readings. So yeah, just very different experience than I'm used to, and I really enjoyed it.
That's fantastic. Before we introduce our special guest, I want to say a couple words about my experience of reading this piece. I found this one of the most intertextual things I'd ever read. You've got art, you've got history, you've got fantastic writing in a way that really forces you to sort of reorganize your brain as you go from bit to bit. And I personally find that very healthy. And I think that approach is, when I show you all my favorite frame, I'll say more about the benefits of having to reorganize how you're thinking from moment to moment. And a particular frame in this graphic novel that did that. So now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's very special guest, the author of Ghost River, the one, the only, Dr. Lee Francis IV. Dr. Francis, please turn on your mic and your camera. Come on in. And before I ask Dr. Francis to say a few words about himself, I'd like to tell you a bit about what I know about him. So Dr. Lee Francis IV, Pueblo of Laguna, is the head indigenerd and CEO of Red Planet BNC, the only native and indigenous pop culture company in the United States, with the hope to change the perceptions of native and indigenous people through dynamic and imaginative pop culture representations. He's been published in multiple publications ranging from poetry to short stories. His first comic book, Six Killer, debuted June 18th. His follow-up, Ghost River, was published in 2019 and has been both lauded throughout the US and abroad. He has also contributed to numerous RPGs, hold on to your seatbelts here, including Devil's Run and Avatar: The Last Airbender, which we must discuss this evening. He's a strong advocate for Native American youth with a focus on community literacy and entrepreneurship. He lives in North Carolina with his family, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Lee Francis IV.
Oh, hey, thank you for the introduction. That's awesome. I much appreciate it. Gwatsi haupa to washrap wahindame Lee Francis, washesh kawekame ifmerikaname. So I'm Lee Francis. My family's from the Pueblo of Laguna on my dad's side, Kawake, and yeah, the Pueblo of Missouri on my mom's side. So it's all Anglo all the time over on the other half of the family. So I'm rocking and rolling.
So, to get things started, we always like to get a little lived life on the table from all of our participants. So could you take a moment and tell us your fondest memory of working on this piece?
Yeah, I think the best memory that I had was, so in working with the library company, who is ultimately our producer and publisher, they helped fund everything. They brought us out to Philadelphia to visit with Native scholars and to help us frame the book itself. So we all got to go out to Philadelphia in late summer of, let's see if it was published in 2018, and had this amazing experience. It was myself, Ushoya Vitre, we were both flown out, but then we got the chance to meet with other folks from the National Museum of the American Indian and Curtis Zuniga, who was one of the lead consultants, my dear mentor and elder, Lenape elder and leader, and who brought so much, to the book itself. So just kind of meeting everybody. And if you know Tim Truman's work, so Timothy Truman, who the creator of Scout, and so much other stuff, lives out there. So he actually joined us. So we had this great day-long tour where we were on the bus visiting historical sites. And I think probably the most powerful was going to the Conestoga Indian Town. And right now it's farmland. The hill that they had, which was, it was a hill with a long it was a marking pole at the time. That's long been gone. The hill's been kind of plowed down a little bit, but there's still the plaque, and being able to stand there. And I think that was one of the most important pieces, was to be in the space of these people, right? So my people are desert people. And so this was this obligation and this responsibility that I think we had to be a part of that. So it's profound on numerous levels. One was to be in this space, the historical space itself. But also two, that I think it's so important that if you're going to write about, folks that aren't your own folks, and, we got some kin lines, but if they're not your own folks, you got to go be there. You have to be in that space. Just because I say I'm Native American doesn't necessarily mean that stretches to me being able to write about all Native Americans, right? I don't have the expertise to be able to do that for a lot of what I consider kin and relatives. I mean, we're connected, but there's still a necessity to being able to go out. So that was probably the most amazing experience of everything that we did in terms of the first part of actualizing the book. And it's actually where I came up on that trip, was where I came up with the first words of the book. So it came out great.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So here's what we're going to do here. We're going to start with Teresa. I'm going to show you the frame that she picked. She's going to tell you why she liked it, and then we'll all talk about that for a moment. Can you all see that image? Okay, Teresa, please.
I just need to take a moment. I'm unexpectedly emotional. I mean, I'm a very emotional person to begin with, in the best possible ways, right? But looking at this page again, what's happening is that when I read this the first time, I was trying to follow the story, and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to let it go. I'm not catching all the nuances, the historical nuances yet, and that's okay. I'm going to read this again. So I was just kind of going through for, let's move it along in my brain kind of thing. And this is the first page where I really paused. And then, of course, what happens after hit me so hard that it made this page even more important for my reading. So this pause in my reading was all about this moment of community. For me, it felt like this this communal moment, this coming together, this around the lantern, which feels very much like a campfire. It really strikes me in that way, gathering around the campfire. We've got the, you know, the song or the chanting. And my, like the sound in my head was a sort of crackling campfire sound. I thought, well, that's interesting because it's a lantern, but, and the sense of like the cold and the warmth all coming together. And then art-wise, I was just so impressed by the cobblestones. The cobblestones to me feel so alive in that they're so painstakingly done, right? They're so different from one another. So I imagine, and I don't know this for a fact, but I imagine the illustrator here just really creating these individually. I love the woman at the bottom, the back of her head, how you have a sort of a detailed braid there. I'm also an artist, and there's something about the back of a woman's head that has braided hair that really speaks to me. That's kind of what my hair looks like when I do a single braid. So I just love the warmth of this page. And then when we move along, we have that page turn and that 2-page spread, that close up that looks like the giant fire, and then the moment that I won't spoil in case someone's going to talk about that. It just hit me so hard what happens after this. This is like the last quiet moment. And so I just really, this page. So this is my favorite page of the whole book.
Anyone want to follow up on that?
I'm not crying, you're crying.
No, we're all crying. We're all crying. No, because this is one of those pages, one of those pieces of artwork that is universal amongst cultures. If you are particularly between people of color, right? And Lee, I really appreciate what you said before about not aiming to create a monolithic voice for Indigenous people. You're like, I can't do that. That's inappropriate. But at the same time, you told things that speak to multiple cultures that have ever experienced that sense of, we don't know what's next, but we know what we've got is each other right now. Like if that's all we've got, we understand that. And there was something about that page, which is a good pull, Teresa, obviously, that speaks across cultures. Like as a Black man, I saw that and I was like, I know ancestors of mine had this moment. Like, I know that without question, without knowing that story, I know that. And beautiful, beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you look up in the upper right corner, you have the Christian tune being sung, and that song has been overlaying this entire theme. You don't, experiencing that song is ambiguous. In other words, it's got that somber vibe of the tune, but it's a different culture's form of mourning and reverence. And the juxtaposition adds to a sort of decentered state that, you know, Teresa, when you were talking, those the cobblestones became very cold to my knees, right? In other words, it does come alive more. And one of the things I've noticed in all of this is just the layering that plays out across the frames and across the story. Stunning.
One of the things I noticed with the pages that we pull and all of the stuff that we study and that we talk about in ReggieCon is a lot of times we're drawn to the art for very obvious reasons. And for me, this page, of course, I was drawn to the art, but it's a narrative moment. Like narratively, it is so rich that it really calls for that pause. And I found that, you know, as I'm, you know, getting choked up talking about it, it's because I feel that again. I feel that pull to pause in that moment. And I'm just like, oh, this was a good one.
Absolutely. Lee, if you have anything you want to say in response to what we've said, feel free.
Well, I got the behind the scenes. So Teresa, that you're absolutely right. And it's one of the jokes that we kind of make about this. Because I was there top to bottom. This wasn't something where like it was handed off to a show-yo. Like we were in constant communication. She hand illustrated every brick in the book and every cobblestone. And we kind of made this joke about it. And when we still talk, like when we go and we do talks and whatever, it's kind of this inside joke now, because I remember like her emailing back, or she posted on Facebook, she's like, if I have to illustrate another brick, I'm going to murder somebody, because she did every single one by hand. And she talks a lot about her process. I think she talks about it in the excerpts of how she found, like, the pigment, like she found traditional handmade pigment. Like this process, has so much of her heart, both of our hearts in this, right? I'm behind a computer, but like what she brought into this, because I think we have felt such an obligation. And that actually is my favorite scene. It was my favorite scene to write. It's hard, very hard, because I know as the writer what's coming, and I know what's next. And I'll tell you, and not to, I mean, we may get into a second. So I'll just say that we get into the next couple of panels. But that one in particular was just like that. It was that moment of pause and the juxtaposition of the song, where, because it's the day, it's Christmas Day, it's Christmas Day, because they were killed on the 26th. So it was the day after Christmas. So this is Christmas Day, and they're in the workhouse. And so this song, I was like, there's probably like a festivity going on outside of where they are, right? People aren't wringing their hands. There's almost a moment that I was like, they're still forgotten. Even though they were brought into this space, they're still kind of forgotten. And so it is that moment. And then that next page with the fire, that was also like those two pages, because in the next page is when I was able to find, with Curtis's help, the translation of the Our Father into Lenape. So that's actually, Lenape is the language that you see juxtaposed between the two, because they were Christian. So they were Christianized, and it also speaks to the Moravian Lenape, who were Christian Lenape at the time as well. So they would have had, I mean, we took a little bit of liberties on that, because the Conestoga, we don't know what language they spoke. So that was kind of the closest we could get to a heritage language. Possibly some derivation of Algonquin, could have been a little Lenape. We don't know, right? So it was where they kind of fell, because they didn't have a record, and by the time people got around to it, they were gone. So, but yeah, I love that. That was a difficult page, but I think that pause and that breath was just kind of like, what else can we do? We prayed together, and that's what we'll do.
Can I ask if there was the purposeful inclusion that the lamplight, the fire from the lamplight, creates a cross of sorts on the ground itself, and that's kind of what everyone's huddled around? Was that done on purpose?
From Wishowio's perspective, I did not write that. She was she's very deliberate. So when she and I worked together, we worked together on Six Killer. We've worked together on several other things. It's that artist, you get that writer illustrator rapport where it's like, I write this thing and I know what she's going to put on. And so I can shorthand a lot of stuff, because I already know it's in good hands and she's going to take it the direction. So when I see it, I was just like, it's better than what I thought. Like you took it exactly what was in my head and literally made it better than what was in my head. Yep. Right. So yeah, so she took that and ran it, because I added, they were in this particular space. And like I said, I don't want to kind of spoil it. When we get to it a little bit later, I can talk a little bit more about those next pages. So
that's fantastic. On that note, we're going to go to Victor's.
Yay.
Okay, so Victor,
mine's a little bit of a cheat here. So,
oh, nice.
I chose this one. It's obviously at the beginning, right? Literally some of the first pages that you will see of this story once you get into it. But I think it's almost the most important piece here. It's creating the sense of an unexpected expectation about this. You look at this and you go, this is fantasy. This is something mythological. And therefore you come at the story with a bit of whimsy. And it's the right way for you to perceive this story initially before you're hit with the truth of what this story is. It's not history, it's this story. Like it's so very real. Beyond what this page sets up. And I thought it was the best lead bearing I've ever seen when it comes to a story. But at the same time, it doesn't bury anything. It's actually giving you a full-on context of culture that, when you see this, you go, okay, this is a grand people and old people who have an understanding of the beginning, what they believe the beginning is, and then to juxtapose that with seeing their end. Huge. But you really have to understand their concept of the beginning to really see how prolific their end actually was to get to that space. So I thought that in terms of storytelling, this was one of the coolest things that I've ever seen, because again, one, it's disarming, but at the same time, it is the perfect alley-oop for the gut punch of truth that this story is. Like, that's just like so on point. I loved it. I had to pick this one. And I felt like it was a little bit of a cheat because it was like first pages, but at the same time, like looking at what this does as a narrative piece, because that's my jam. Narrative and story is everything to me. And this is one of those key pieces where you really see how you managed, manipulated, and served story in a way that beautifully done.
Thanks.
You're very welcome.
When I saw this image, I said, okay, we are now in indigenous ontology. We are now into holism. And it's there in the image. Everything's about everything. Nothing's about itself. We all come from the same type of being. And I'm ready for this. And it's just right there. And it's, as Victor and everyone here knows, I love holism and I love everything's about everything. So very much appreciated that image.
For me, the mythology of the turtle, the tortoise, the shell, there's something about this, animal that's so mythical, that lends itself to all kinds of storytelling. Salvador Plasencia in The People of Paper uses tortoises as symbols for, I think tortoise shells or the like cars, and there's all kinds of playing with that. And I was reminded of that, but also of this idea of the growth coming from the shell. I think it's so interesting and so just generative of this idea of something that is so much older. So tortoises look really old to begin with, right? And I just love how they look so wise and they're so beautiful. Yeah, exactly. And they're so slow, but they're so compelling at the same time. And I love tortoise shells. I love turtle shells and looking at them and the design. So seeing how there's this emergence of the forest and the growth and the history coming out of the shell, I just found that super compelling. And then with the narrative, there was a part, I'm pulling it up so I can read it a little bit better. This idea of the roots. So from this root came another sprout, and from that sprout grew a woman, and all humankind grew from these two together, the man and the woman. It was so suggestive of that constant cycle of life and growth, right? So even though you could say it's a bit of a cheat because it's in the beginning, it's a really important beginning. And I have to say that if this exists as an original piece somewhere, we need to talk. Have that. Just saying.
How you gonna try to grift my page? Like that was
I think
you back up. I said it. I threw it out there.
I think it's gonna. We'll have to. I think it's at the library company, so we can have a caper. So we'll have to go and
I love this.
Like go into the archives, so we can totally have a caper for that.
From ReggieCon springs a caper. The first.
That's right. It's brilliant.
Yeah, Teresa, there are two words you said there that I really resonate to, and that's generative, right, and emergent. And you look at an image like that, and it's not just this is where I come from, it's also this is what I am.
Right.
And the indigenous ontology of experiencing yourself of and in nature as opposed to nature. Mm-hmm. Nature is not something to conquer because nature is what I am. That thoroughgoing understanding of relationality, it's all there, and puts me in the right frame of mind.
It's got it. I mean, it's almost in reference to the page that Teresa chose, and that line, heaven and nature as one. that's what this is.
Yeah.
This is the great turtle. And I'm not gonna lie, I did feel a little bit of a Avatar: The Last Airbender-ness with this as well. So
Totally.
I didn't do that intentionally, but yes, that's, it shows up, right? Because
Exactly.
of these sort of traditional spaces. I think, Scott, also to your point, for me, it was this, the narrative as it's been established is always a Western narrative. So the story, the way that it comes in historically, is about Ben Franklin riding out to stop the Paxton boys, right?
Yeah.
So I do want to point out very deliberately to everybody watching that when you read the comic, we call them murderers. It's written in the whole point. They're not boys. I do not associate, and I fought for that one. I didn't fight for it. Everybody agreed, but I was like, this is not, this is people that murdered innocents, 20 people they literally rode 100 miles inland to kill defenseless people. And yet, shucks, they were just boys I was like, nah, they're murderers, right?
Mhm.
So, but that's the story. The story is always their story. It's from the Paxton perspective and why they did what they did, because they were all upset about, the Indians did it to whatever, right? And same thing was and then it was Ben Franklin's story and how Ben Franklin saved Philadelphia, or it was the Quaker story and how the Quaker Empire fell down. And so the setting of this and starting it with this traditional, and it is a Lenape story. Again, we don't have a Susquehanna Conestoga story. So we started with Lenape story. We got that from Curtis Zuniga. And, with permission, because he is one of the keepers, he's a knowledge keeper. So he has permission to use that origin story and traditional story, which he asked for permission for, was to set the tone that you're not reading somebody else's story. You're reading their story. You're reading an indigenous story, top to bottom. I'm not telling anybody else's story at this point. I'm telling this story, our perspective only.
That's fantastic. So we'll go ahead and we'll move on to Eric's image. So Eric, if you can see that, the floor is yours.
Well, actually, that's a wonderful segue, because I picked this page because for me, at least the theme that continued to pop to me as a reader was the importance of voice and of storytelling generally. And I feel like when I look at this page, thematically, we have this sort of meta narrative of what I assume was your visit to Philadelphia doing the research, or these creators. And you've got first of all, you got these two speech balloons up on the top pan, or the carriers, and they don't have tails clearly linking into a speaker. So it's already kind of, doing something a little bit different than comic readers are used to, right? It could be any of them speaking or all of them, which I thought was really cool. And then as you go down, sort of this question here of, who tells, the story of these folks, where their voice in all of this. And then you have this beautiful zoom out towards almost the entire series of panels, but at the end you zoom out outside of the room, outside of the building, and you have silence, right? That question just sort of hangs in the air and it lingers, and then you turn it to the next page and that question is still with you. And for me, that question then, every time I read it, it's on every page for me.
That's fantastic.
Amazing.
Anyone want to respond to Eric?
I did enjoy the fourth wall breaking of this story by way of showing you telling this story or getting to that space. Because I think that's also what adds to the verisimilitude of the whole thing. You know what I mean? Like, it's not just you telling this story, you are impacted by it personally. And asking the question within the context. It's not even something that somebody has to glean. You are literally putting it on the page like, this is why we have to do this. And there's an authenticity to it that just, it sings.
Yeah, I think there's a ton of humility in this page as well. What this page says to me is, yes, we are researching, trying to find their voice so we can present it. And we're going to present ourselves looking for that voice in a traditional Western kind of frame. And I just thought that was bold, right? You're not putting yourself in an imagery like the very first page. You're putting yourself in a contemporary setting. And again, I almost want to call this the onion story. And what I mean by that is just these wonderful intertextual layers that you can just keep peeling back. And every time you go through it, you can find another layer to peel back. And even as something as straightforward as this is just full of wonderful layers and mystery and nuance that bears, rereading over and over.
As a process nerd, I love this so much. I'm like, yay! We get to see the building and the building of the story, the background, the work that's involved that is apart from the writing and the drawing. So something that we don't normally get to see. And I'm always interested in whatever it is that I'm reading in comic form. Can I teach this, right? Because I always want to bring new stuff to my students. And this section, the going back and forth, which, by the way, if I can digress for a second, there's that one page that spread the page that has the overhead, the aerial view. I freaking love that page. That is so cool. That's like grad school right there. When you're sitting there working on everything spread out on the table. I just had to say that. But I love this because it gives me a moment as a professor to pause with my students, right? And go back and talk about this, like what's going on here and what are some of the complications that are involved with research and reconstructing other people's stories. Like, let's talk about this for a minute. So thanks for that.
Yeah, Lee, go ahead and respond to that.
Yeah, this was, there were two things that were at play. One, because, I mean, like I said, this moment for us, I felt was so profound, right? Like it was so important to be there in the space. And I didn't feel like it needed to be like, it wasn't an afterthought. It needed to be in the story itself. Like it was part of the story. We are now part of this whole narrative because and I think that really plays into, indigenous epistemology, ontology, axiology of like, we're all now part of this story. We are carrying the story. We have this responsibility. I will not forget this story. I will tell the story of Ghost River. I will tell the story of the Conestoga peoples, right? So because I have been, entrusted with that, right? I've been entrusted by the people. I've been entrusted by their descendants. I've been entrusted by creation. This is, this is where I'm now a part of this. And so I kind of felt like I had to, plus there was so much richness of just like our conversations. I was like, how do I put that in here? I mean, like we have the back matter and the material and we kind of, we filled it out to kind of so everybody could see, but I was like, needs to be a part of it. The other part is I'm a big fan of honoring the people that are a part of this. So I write them into the work. Actually, Uncle Curtis is in there as well. He's the museum docent. So he's the one telling the kids about the picture. Like I was, about the William Penn, the signing of, the Lenape treaty, right? And so I was like, yeah, I was like, I got to write Uncle Curtis into this. He was so impactful, and I got to write, Will Fenton, who was our publisher on this, and I have to write, Wishoyo into that. Although she was super uncomfortable, she's like, I do not like to draw myself, and I was like, too bad, and I was like, you did a great job. You did a great job on you. You did a great job on me. I was like, thank you very much. And that was pretty much like she went back to the pictures. That was literally, I was exactly what I was wearing that day. I had my necklace, awesome. Black shirt. So it is down to what we wore when we went to visit it. And so, I mean, like you're saying, Scott, it's like, I like doing that also to give, it's a pause moment, right? Because we've got to build this small narrative. There's the thing that happened in early December, the first part of the massacre, and then the second part, and then there's the other sections of the Moravian story, right? And the pamphlet wars themselves and how that played out. So even out of necessity was having to do some time bending. And so then how do you do some break beats when you're already time bending? And I was like, well, let's throw in and make it a meta narrative as part of that as well. So I'm a part of it. There was the 250th naming ceremony where they said all the names, and we brought in all of our other folks that were part of Circle Legacy. They're all actually represented as characters in the book as well. So all the people that were part of it are part of all of those meta components. And it is the onion, right? It's like, here's this piece, and then here's this piece, and then there's a moment for you to take a break, right? I was like, this is kind of like, take a breath, because it's going to get a little worse coming in for a couple of minutes, and then take a breath, and then it's going to get a little worse for a little while, and then it's going to get better because we're singing the story. So
yeah, I do kind of want to know where I can go to learn time bending. I mean, airbending. I will tell you,
Dr. Grace Dillon. It's indigenous futurisms right there. It's the slipstream, it's time bending.
Let's go.
Check all of the work out. That's the whole guidebook right there.
That's absolutely fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and share my favorite image. It's this one here. Lee, you and I actually had a chance to talk about this one when we talked initially. And I hope you'll forgive my taking a picture of myself reading this as a way to add to the onion that I'm unpeeling here. So first, I just want to say a little bit about visual science, right? Because it's important to understand that this is the kind of image that some psychologists would call, well, I'm talking about the middle frame here, right? Surplus structure. And what that surplus structure means is there are many, many different fields, many different images your vision can collapse into. So you can collapse into the cartoon, the image he's showing him. You can collapse into his face. You can collapse onto his hand holding the pamphlet. And all of those different abilities to collapse are moments that require your brain to reorganize. Now, you don't feel it. You just look from one moment to the next. But those moments of what I'll call neural stability and neural instability are extremely healthy. And I think they are actually things that lead us to be more open to difference and diversity. It's this idea of exercising, reframing your brain and reframing your brain in the same space. And I'm just going to read the text there. So we read, sir, know our Bible well, sir. We know the words you speak and how you show how you show who we are. This is what you think of us. We are savages, wanton women. And I remember reading this for the first time, and it's not just you've got a picture of his face, and then in the next part of it, you've got his hand. So they're kind of out of frame, but in frame. But it's this sort of recursive representation of the issue that you're trying to make. And when I saw that, I thought this wasn't done so that you could just fit that little close-up in there and it all in the same frame. This was done to force those kind of reorganizations on my part. And so I loved that. I thought it was a brilliant way to attack the notion of representation and re-representation and telling story and who's speaking. And I hope you forgive that I put my own thumb in the image, but I couldn't help myself. So thank you for this. It's just fantastic.
Well, and misrepresentation too,
yes.
Right? Because this is a moment where misrepresentation gets called out.
Yes.
Like, are you kidding me here? And it's a very brave thing to do, because I feel like that third panel, the way that is presented reminds us of the power structure here, right? Where she is positioned and where he is positioned, and even that we see more of him. And we see the sort of noble profile. Even it's a reminder for the reader of what's going on, and that moment where she speaks out is a very risky moment.
Lee, did you want to respond to any of that?
No, first off, I will point out the bricks behind them. I definitely have to throw out those are not replicated bricks. There's cracks over on the left-hand side. And anyway, just reiterating kind of from before, but when Michelle, and I think that is the brilliance that she was able to bring, right? When you find the right illustrator who can absolutely just is masterful. She is a master of her craft. This is the highest value that I can put on any type of comic book making and illustration, to be able to capture these various pieces, and especially because my writing is saying it's 4 panels, here's an inset, this is what we're doing. We want to show this image. And we do want to, I built in, this is the Moravian Lenape here in Philadelphia. This is I wanted specifically to have a confrontation, to basically say, like, these are Christians and this is how they're being portrayed. They would know what they're seeing and what they're reading. They're not dummies. So also on top of that is not only it's tackling the layers of misrepresentation. She's tackling it directly with her words, but also our perceptions of what we view as the noble savage or the Pocahontas, right? The Indian whore, this idea of, this wantonness that actually starts with this image, because there are no other images prior to this outside of some etchings that were done. But this is the first mass produced image of Native women. And Michelle, you and I had a big conversation around the images and representations of Native women and how we get from this in 1763 to missing murdered Indigenous women today, right? So this is really immensely powerful for me to be able to showcase this on multiple levels, but especially as a Native woman, basically saying, like, what are you all printing about us? We have, we're Christian like you, and this is truly what you think of us. And it's also like this panel on this page makes me both angry and sad. Like, sad from her perspective is like, but this is such a breaking of a trust. We followed God. We've done all the things that you have asked us to in some ways, that we have come to. And this is what it comes down to. And his position is basically just to throw off, thank goodness, like the next page is like, thank goodness that's the best you have. Like, we're not going to deal with you anyway. Like he's like, oh yes, that's a problem. He's like, but be careful of how you speak to me. And, Dr. Franklin, I don't think he was doctor at the time. I think he was Mr. Franklin. So, and we had some really good historical checks on that, but it was like, that was really a necessary piece for me to write, again, on some of this onionness, right? Thumbs and all of trying to showcase, like both what I wanted to say. And, I was like, listen, if we're going to take these spaces, we're going to take these spaces, because who knows what that conversation was, but it's not too far out of line that there wouldn't have been something to that effect, right? Like, we see they're dramatic interpretations, but it's not that far out that somebody would question somebody about something,
Fantastic.
So,
Amelia, do we have questions? I thought I saw a raised hand.
Nope, no questions right now, but if anyone has questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A and we'll pass them out to the panelists.
So what we'll do now is we'll just ask Lee, do you have any questions of us?
I honestly, I don't know if I have any questions in the sense of, because I think it's covered. I was like, it's always that question. I was like, did you get it? Did you get what I was trying to do as the writer? You got the layers, right? I was like, you've already answered that part. I was like, everybody got it. So that's great.
Yeah.
I guess the question is, if you have been using, like Teresa say, or if you have used it in your classroom or you're teaching from it, what's the reception been? I'm really always curious, because as the writer, it's a goose. You put it out into the world, and then you don't know how people are going to, come back to it. So how has it been in terms of the conversations, if anybody's been using it, or maybe how you think you might use it? So,
well, this gives me an excuse to say we need to keep in touch, because this was my first reading for this panel, and so I haven't used it yet, but I will be using it for sure. Probably next fall. I am transitioning to working on or to teaching more ethnic studies courses, because the state of California, and I'm so happy about this, is now requiring students at not just the 4-year university level, but at the community college level, to take at least one ethnic studies course. So what I've done is I have learned how to write curriculum. I didn't know how to do this, a year ago. And I wrote an intro class. I wrote a intro to Latinx studies course. And I'm like, wait, but what do I really want to teach? I want to teach a comics class. That's what I want to do. So, so I just wrote a Latinx comic studies class, and that's in the process of curriculum. And the next one I'm writing is I want to think of how to title this because, of course, it multi-ethnic, comic studies comes to mind, but I want to give it a more nuanced title. All this to say is that I have in mind, I have to use this book in that class. I think this would be just a fantastic. And I want to say thank you. Whoever, whether it's you or whoever is responsible for the digital version of this, is just needs to get like a raise, a bonus, a present, baked goods, something.
Yeah. Hugs,
Because
lots of hugs.
Hugs, yeah. Like I'll give you my address. Because for our students, so I think it's very important that for those of us who can to get the hard copy, right? And I'm a hard copy kind of girl, so I love that. So I have the hard copy. I mean, the hard copy is going to be part of my collection, but for my students, sometimes that's not possible. And I do what I can to make things accessible to them, number one, but also encouraging them and talking to them about how when we spend our money on these things, it helps create more of this kind of work. And that's really important to acknowledge the importance of the labor. But the extra bits, all the videos, maps, every single little extra piece of information, like, holy cow, that was great. I found myself, there was that moment, I don't know if this is who you were saying was, I think your uncle or your cousin, my
kid.
The one who's, who is talking about the painting. And then, so I click on the eye and like, there he is. I was like, oh my God. It's like, we know each other now. That was very exciting. And I think that that's going to be a very different experience for my students. And I think it's going to just blow them away that they can do that they can get those extra little bits. So I'm really looking forward to that.
I think it almost deserves like its own special coin name, like comicumentary like type of thing, because like it's so very different for the reading experience. And I think it's, like I said, I'm not a digital comics fan like almost at all. Like I almost abhor like digital comics. I want to feel the page and everything. But I loved this. Like that was a phenomenal experience.
I'm going to figure out how to do both so that they have to do, both, so that it's not just that experience, but I want them to have the hard copy experience. And then we'll do like a set. Speaking of layers, another layer.
There you go.
Thing with the digital.
It's thanking both the library company and Will Fenton, as the editor. Credit where credit is due. He had this idea for this. He came out and did his responsibilities. He met with me and with Shoyo. He came out to the Indigenous Comic-Con, kind of was looking for artists and had already approached us about publishing it. And then, we put the piece together, and that their internal team, they came out and did video at the shop, and they came out and they sent their folks to with Shoyo and her studio. And I mean, the work that they put, it's weird because I'm like, it's like there's pre-COVID and post-COVID time. I was like, oh my God, that's right. They did that, didn't they? Because it was like, it was kind of so long ago. We did this 2018. I mean, we're pushing on 3 years. And I was just like, oh, that's right. They came out to the shop and they were super nice, and they were super awesome and interviewed me. And, and then they interviewed everybody. I was like, that's right. We put this whole thing, because there was a museum exhibit that went with this too. That's crazy. I forgot about that as well. So, I mean, they pulled out all the stops, and ultimately the funder, which is the Pew Foundation or the Pew Heritage out of Philadelphia, did so much. And just the fact that they took a shot on this, and how much the legs that this has continued to have is really great. So I highly recommend it. And last thing for you, Teresa, we have actually there are only 3 native Californian comics that we have if you want for your curriculum as well. So all of them by Jake Lowry, who is Southern California native. My sister's, I cannot remember the third one, and it's the other one is his World War I historicization of his family that went and fought natives fighting in World War I. So, and I think are the only ones that carry it. So you can he sells it, but you can find it.
Thank you.
Following up on Victor's point about calling this a commumentary, right? The digital thing is not the digitization of an analog book.
Right.
It's one of those moments
Right.
where you have a qualitatively distinct medium, and to be able to capitalize on it and recognize its uniqueness and make it happen is very cool. Lee, I want to ask you a quick question. We have students in the audience, and of course, going through all some of that back matter, you described your time bending in terms of indigenous epistemology and the need to tell the story in nonlinear ways. And when I saw you contextualize that with the notion of indigenous epistemology, I thought it might be helpful for our students for you to say something about what that might mean, and then how that played out in your approach to this project.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, it comes down to this essentialization and centering. There's two ways to approach this. One, it is a centering around indigenous ways of being and knowing that focus on three areas that Dr. Castellano talks about, which is, these three ways of knowing are actualized in the traditional, the empirical, and the revealed. And so the traditional is where you gain traditional knowledge. So that's your storytelling knowledge. That's your, like anything that comes through you from that sort of oral tradition or from your cultural values and perceiving cultural values, et cetera. The empirical is the empirical. It's what you perceive. It's what you watch. It's what you do through experience. And then the revealed is what we call prophecy knowledge, right? So it's the moments of the muse. It's the dream time or the dreaming, from my Australian relations, right? So, and those three intertwine with each other to build the knowledge base. That's indigenous epistemology. One is not privileged over the other. Say, for example, in Western epistemologies, empiricism is the most prized. It is the objective, right? It's the interconnectedness and interrelatedness that exists because all three of those build upon each other. The revealed knowledge could also be considered intuitive knowledge, right? So it's that sense of intuition. It's that, but it's built on fundamentals of potentially, repetition, or built around traditional kinds of values that are experimented through empiricism that are then reinforced through, this idea of the revealed. So that is, I think, it's the easiest way. I mean, there's so many variations on that, obviously, because indigeneity is so multifaceted. So that's probably a good fundamental summary in terms of an amalgam way, but then starts to get a little bit more sort of microcosm, because my Pueblo epistemologies are much different than, say, Lenape epistemologies, right? Because I'm a desert people. We didn't face forced removal. We have a different type of, historical trauma, in terms of who our colonizer was, as opposed to my East Coast relations, who intermarried up and down the coast, who had all sorts of, our Black relatives, all up, a lot of these folks were coastal people and they were whalers and they did all sorts of stuff. So there are different epistemologies based on each indigenous group, but it really does, those fundamentals kind of hold, throughout.
No, that's fascinating. Data indicate that roughly 80% of the world's populations lives in these sorts of what I refer to as holist ontologies. Everything's about everything, nothing's about itself. 20% of the world's population lives in more individualist ontologies, and they happen to live in the United States and Europe. So, bringing this holist view to our students, is something that I do at every level when I can, because once you can get someone to experience themselves as part of everything, then you experience the ubiquity of meaning. And then life becomes a matter of managing meaning and suffering, as opposed to being right or being wrong or being analytic. And, currently in our culture, I think it's even more important that we get people to feel themselves as part of everything, as opposed to struggling to be empirically right or wrong. So I really appreciate the work sort of making that point.
Very much so.
Thank you.
Can we talk
Thanks.
about the murders? Can we talk about that moment? Because we kind of led up to it a little bit.
Yeah.
So I really want to know about let me start with this briefly and say that moment the way that it's depicted, the way that it's written, the way that it's illustrated just hit me so hard that I had to stop reading. And that's good, right? I had to stop and sit in that moment more than any other moment in the entire. And then I had to sort of look at the images and like, oh my God, like the belt and the people, and that's coming together in this series of images. And so I want to know about the writing of that, and the how the writing and the illustration come together, and just what was the, I don't know, emotionally for you, what was that like?
So there were two fundamentals that we kind of came into with both of the scenes, because you essentially have two scenes that take place. There's the one at Conestoga Indian Town, and then the final, the final in Lancaster at the workhouse. But what we started to adapt to is because we had, some apocryphal, but because there wasn't a confirmed version after the Conestoga Indian Town part of the massacre. But what some of the reports had said was that the wampum belt was there. It was buried in the ashes, and it would have been, this wampum, that this belt that had set the town, like it was the treaty, right, that gave them the space to be able to live there with William, with Penn's blessing, essentially, and in theory his descendants. The wampum itself, obviously, is incredibly significant to East Coast folks, especially from the Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, all the way down the coast. It's incredibly I just wrote a whole thing on this one too. We put a comic up at the National Museum of the American Indian. So if anybody goes to see Native New York, you'll see more of our work. But making wampum, and especially back then, is so ridiculously difficult, right? It is exceptionally difficult. So wampum belts are very, very valuable. And the way that the people think about it, that it's part of your spirit. So you're imbuing your spirit into this, right? So that's a through line that starts to play through, and it becomes important in the final section. But the other part is that I'm not going to show dead and dying Indians on screen or on page, right? So in both of those, and also I wasn't going to show the faces of the Paxton murderers. So you can see that very clearly. They don't get an identity. They are always shown in shadow. They are the boogeyman in this story, right? They don't get to be individuals because they robbed these individuals, right, of their lives. So they don't get to be individuals. They're monsters. And I was very clear when I started writing it. So the first murder that you see, the first four that are killed, six that are killed, you kind of see the aftermath. They show up, they're there. You see the one sort of motion. There's no dialogue. We were very clear. It's all kind of what's taking place, within your own frame and your own sound. And then it just happens. And then you see that part of the wampum right there, right? So we established that early, and Wishoyo did that marvelously. Now we get to the second one, and this is why I want to tell the story. So there is a story behind it, because I actually wrote a different scene. When I first sat down to write it, what I wrote was essentially that they were in the basement of the workhouse, and that the door opens wide and all this light comes in on them. And then the shadows close in on them. And then that's the end of that frame. And then all you see is them, there's some blood, and then the shadows sort of drifting back into the snow. So that kind of last scene is similar to what I had in mind. And so it's this frame back. So it's frame by frame by frame by frame by frame. Well, we wrote it, and I was like, it was very emotional to write it. Wishoyo love it. We were all just, we were just really great. And one of our historians was like, didn't happen. And I was like, what? And they were like, didn't happen in the basement. As far as we can tell from the actual historical record, it was in the yard. They came and got him in the yard, and that's where they executed them. And I was just like, and there's an email between me, or it was a phone call or an email between me and Will was like, listen, man, it's historic. You can take it. He's like, if you want to keep it, don't take some liberties. This is the moment to take those liberties. And Wishoyo stepped in. She says, let me think on it. I have an idea. And I was like, we were like, okay, we're starting to get down to the wire. We're like, all right, but we got to come up with something. So she's like, give me the weekend. So she came up with the weekend, and she sent us this script. She scripted it out for us, and she sent us a script and some sketches. And Will and I both were just like, no, that's the way it needs to look. And that breaking of the wampum and the people as the beads falling into the snow. And then still that same background always gets me as well, right? Like that, because it is that destruction. And also when I wrote this part, I did write that last frame on page 57, that they would not be, because too much of the images prior to this were showing them screaming, you know, and crying and catastrophic. They face their, I was like, nah, they're going to face them straight on, eye to eye. There's, you know, this is how it's going to, there's not screaming or crying. It's just kind of breaking. So I was really, this one I wrote very, very deliberately. And then Wishoyo touched it, but we had the same intention between the two of us about how we wanted this to be framed. And it is probably one of the most powerful moments. Later, after we finished this, we found out that there is another story of a group of Lenape, Moravian Lenape, that were also massacred, and they were singing hymns as they were killed, and we didn't know that. Like, so I have the hymn that they sang earlier on, and then this moment where while they were being murdered, they were singing Christian hymns, you know, to their Lord, to creation at that time. And I was like, that's one of those moments where you're like, that's some Muse crazy, you know, type of trippy stuff where we'd all start to wag out, be like, I didn't read that. I did not come across that as far as I know in my research, because I went back to look for notes. I was like, did I see this already?
No, that was
and
the ancestors whispering to you, bro. That's what that was.
Wrote it. Yeah, it was straight up. So yeah, so those things, and that's of course why the book then ends the way it does, with live, living Native people. It is the title of the book. It is the fall and rise of the Conestoga. So I'm, you know, that scene in particular was so beautifully done. And still, you know, I'm not crying, you're crying. That one always gets me, because Wishoyo did such an amazing job. And I think in some ways that page summarizes American relations. It is the breaking of the wampum. This was a trust that was engendered. We believed that these were unbreakable, and this destruction of that. And so what I think the last part is in the exhibit, which I think is this, you know, again, sort of the rise, like this was all meta, because we had the exhibit, we had the digital, we had the physical, is that we have a special wampum that was commissioned, a wampum belt that was commissioned for the exhibit itself, that now resides in the Library Company in Philadelphia as part of their permanent collection, as part of their archive collection. So it's the full circle that the wampum has been repaired with this work.
No, that's beautiful. So we do have a question. Amelia?
Yes, so this question is from Shannon Epplett, who is one of our faculty members here at Illinois State. Dr. Francis, are there other Native stories that you want to tell in this format?
So many. Starting with a couple that we're working on right now that are in kind of like later development. The first one is I'm working with the family of a Narragansett by the name of Tarzan Brown. So he won the Boston Marathon twice. He competed in the Olympics with Jesse Owens, the 36 Olympics in Berlin. So there were 3 men of color that competed in that Olympics. He was one of them. He's this amazing character. I've contacted the family, his descendants, who have given me permission, and with their permission, you know, talking about his story, he was just this incredible, he's this incredible character, this incredible runner. We want to tell the story of, I'm working on the board, I'm part of the Carlisle Indian School project. So wanting to tell a little bit more about the history of Indian boarding schools, especially given the issues that we're having these days about, you know, what I knew is for long that the world kind of is rediscovering, I guess, of like all these unmarked graves of little kids. I was like, yeah, I've been teaching this I know I've been teaching this at least for 20 years, right? I was like, you know, I had stories in one of my classes from a relative that watched his older brother bleed to death on the floor, you know, of a boarding school because they didn't pick him up. So that story, and definitely, you know, for all of these stories about resilience and healing and resistance, you know, as Gerald Visner puts it, you know, survivance, right? So that whole concept of survivance. Native baseball, we want to do a native baseball story and telling the history of, you know, natives in baseball, because, you know, there's so many of them that kind of moved through history. And there's just so many of these kinds of stories. There's the story here of the Lumbee that drove off the KKK. I'm here in North Carolina, right?
Yep.
You know, it's like the Lumbee folks that basically they rallied up, sent the KKK packing. You know, I was like, that's a story, you know, that's been told on one perspective. And I was like, it can still be like, there's enough room to tell all the nuances for these stories. So, you know, there's so many throughout that it's not necessarily trying to single out a particular like terrible instance. You know, like a tragic instance, like, you know, I don't necessarily want to draw a Wounded Knee, you know, and the Wounded Knee massacre, but there are stories that absolutely need to be told because of their significance in terms of how it impacted everything around it, right? So I just saw Leanne Howe's name pop up. I work on tribalography. So her concept of tribalography, that I'm telling stories solely from the Native perspective, and then everything else bubbles around that. So yeah, there's a lot. There's so many to tell. Some of them are farther along in our development process. Some are in shorter development process. But, you know, I was like, and there's so many that, you know, so many folks that reach out to us, they're like, do you have a comic about us? And I was like, not yet, but we'll get there. Just give me a little time. It's coming. So
Amelia, do we have another question?
Nope, no other questions right now, just some comments in the chat.
Okay, excellent. Now, Eric, do you have another question you'd like to ask?
Yeah, so I'm teaching a comic studies course right now. Most of the comics I'm teaching are all within the superhero genre, but I'm sort of thinking in the future of other types of curricula to build, and I'm really interested in this idea of using comics to tell, you know, history, to tell people's stories. And, you know, as a storyteller yourself, right, you're working in this medium. What do you like about, or what do you feel are the strengths of telling people's stories in this medium as opposed to another type of medium?
I mean, honestly, I'll go back. It's the ability to time bend. You get so much you get so much latitude around being able to, you know, move through time frames and break the fourth wall in ways that you don't necessarily through a linear narrative. So say an academic narrative, the closest I would say it comes to is like a memoir, right? So, you know, like teaching it off of memoir, because memoir plays with memory and where where you're going to situate yourself as, are you a reliable narrator? Are you an unreliable narrator, right? So in that sense, when I jumped on this, there's something really interesting, because I didn't realize it until about midway through. I was like, man, this is the same way that, you know, Spiegelman wrote Mouse. Except he used mice, and he's doing the same thing. And I was like, he builds himself into the story, tells the story from his dad's perspective, you know, uses mice to tell the story as a way to really come home graphically, right? So these types of stories can be told in a way that I think are, you know, that you can't do in any other medium, right? And I think that's why I'm stuck with comics. I was like, I'm an academic. We've all got the letters, but I was like, you know, I think comics are the best medium in which to often tell these things. And particularly when you think about it as you're teaching, is the ways in which superhero representations of Native people. There's 400 and some, you saw the one in the book, there's 400 and some years of misrepresentation of Native and Indigenous peoples. We didn't control our own publishing or our own imagery until the early 1900s, right? So there's at least 250 to 300 years where we don't have control of that. So for me, also, this kind of work is showcasing Native people is not, if you look at the book, and, you know, Washoe was meticulous about her research, it's Western dress. They were dressing in the way that folks, you know, and maybe when they were at home it was a little bit more traditional, but it's the dead of winter. I'm not like getting up and putting on a headdress or like, you know, putting on my feathers. But you see that with Native superheroes in the majority of stuff. And I would highly recommend, if you're looking at the book on Native Americans in comics that can be used, is Michael Shayassi's Native Americans in Comics. And he chronicles out the history of Native representation, both by natives and non-natives, from, you know, some of the earliest inceptions. And usually I think what he looks at is like characters that have long runs. So not just like little images, not quick image stuff, but like little side characters, but like, looking at Tonto or American Eagle or, Scalp Hunter, those types of things in the early days of like the platinum age, right? So the pre-golden age, all the way up to sort of modern representations. So in this way, when I'm tackling comics, or I'm using it both as telling historical narratives or, put history as, the big broad concept, it gives me a chance to also re-engineer the imagery and the damage that this kind of imagery has been done because it's been repetitive in these cycles over and over again. Lenape people did not dress, East Coast natives did not dress like their Plains counterparts, except the Plains iconography is what we hold. Well, I'm a Pueblo, I don't dress like that. I was like, I got my bling. That's pretty much what I wear. And I think I've got a Darkwing Duck shirt on. I was like, so I think, yeah. So in terms of, that's teaching it and using those resources, I think it's a great way to tell stories because, it connects the words and the images in a way that you can play and bend time and space and intentionality and memory and all those things can come into play because you get to, you've got images that help guide people along that direction.
I want to know more about this bling. Actually, I've been wanting to ask for a minute now. So if you can tell us more about this, yes.
Yeah. So this is it's beaded, so I don't can't
Oh, nice.
Kind of see it there on the camera.
That's awesome.
So it's a beaded piece. It's a great story. It was the woman that made it for me. I met her up in Denver at Denver Comic-Con. I don't know, it was probably like 7 or 8 years ago at this point, and she was wearing this, and I was like, oh my gosh. Do you have those? Can I get it for sale? Can I buy it? She's like, this is not for sale. She's really funny, but she's just like, it's not for sale. So I was like, all right. She's like, but I do have some for sale. Message me. So I messaged her and, I didn't hear back. And we kind of like played message tag for a little while. And it was like, I don't know, it was about 3 or 4 years after that, back up in Denver Comic-Con. She's like, you ever gonna buy one from me? And I was like, I messaged you. I've been trying to get one. I was like, do you have one right now? I'll buy something from you. And she's got her mom there. Little Indian grandma. She turns to her mom and she's like, hey mom, take it off. And it was just like, I'll take it. I felt kind of bad about taking it from Indian grandma, but also not as bad because I'm giving it a really good home. And this is one of my prized possessions. But that was the best. Like, it was so funny because I was just like, yeah, I'll buy one right now. She's like, mom, take it off. And I was just like, oh, that was unexpected. I'm not going to turn it down though. Right. So take my money and I will the
universe says.
So this is, exactly. So and they're my two, it's Superman and Flash. So, and it's perfect. So it's one of my favorite pieces.
Super dope.
So I'm very curious about your Avatar: The Last Airbender connection.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to pretend as if I can do some narrative bending because I'm going to assume that there is a relationship between, I'm assuming your love of Avatar: The Last Airbender and the type of story that the holist ontology, sort of indigenous ontology that lies at the root of Avatar: The Last Airbender. And I thought maybe you could say something about that. Did I do that?
So
Did I bend that all right?
No, you bended it perfectly. You bent it perfectly. You bended that. It was great. So I'm working with Magpie Games. So they are the licensee and the owners for Avatar: The Last Airbender, the role-playing game. It's the most successfly funded role-playing game Kickstarter in the history of Kickstarter. I think they raised something like $9 million. It was, or even more. That's I think what I can remember. It probably, I know it was like, it might have been higher, right? Like it was just a backing up a dump truck of money. And they reached out to me. I know them from, they're in Albuquerque. I've known Mark Truman, who's the owner and CEO. He reached out, said, hey, this is really important that we get the representation right, even though it's sort of, not representation, but it really is. If you know what, I was like, it is really representation with the Water Tribe. And so he's like, do you know anybody? Do you want to come on board? And I was like, yeah. And I reached out to a number of my Alaskan Native relatives, brought them in to just kind of like have conversations, how, their thoughts on Avatar and things that really spoke to them and why it was important to them and the representational things about seeing themselves, in a way that's heroic, in a way that's not, even analogous, is playing with those concepts of like tradition and technology and family and duty and, all of these types of spaces, and with amazing powers to go with it. Right. So I just actually finished up writing a module for it. like last week. So I've got a piece that's going to go in the books when they all get released, which is going to be like, I think February. They have a very tight deadline. So, so yeah, it was quite an honor to write. And a lot of the stuff that I had heard from, a lot of my relatives that we brought in to talk about it, tried to make sure that was in there. So the idea of like storytelling and the matrilineal, kind of ideas, right? And so I bring a lot of like, I think one of the places that they visit in the adventure is the cultural center, right? So it's the Southern Water Cultural Center, Southern Water Tribe Cultural Center. I was just like, of course we'd have a cultural center in Republic City, obviously. So, because somebody's got some money for it.
You gotta give some love to it, like for real. Because you're absolutely right. It was $9 million, but let's be specific. $9,535,317 with 81,567 backers. That's amazing.
Yeah. No, they went. I mean, I remember when they launched, and they always launch a little low. So I think the launch was like 50K, right? Like it was just like, hey, they already kind of know where it's going to go. But the previous record holder was like 1.4 million, I think, or 1.2 million. And in the first day, they broke that mark. And then it was just like watching it. And I checked in with them a couple of times over at Magpie. I was like, how's it going? They're like, oh my God. I was just like, yeah, you guys this is like tech level numbers. Like this is when somebody makes a gadget. You guys have done it with a book. Like that's so cool. That's so,
Well, if you need any beta.
Yeah, absolutely. I know they've got the, kick them on, I know they've got the, online, they've got the quick start guide too. So anybody wants to take a look at it.
There you go.
I'd be happy to beta test any module you make.
Sure, man. Absolutely.
That's fantastic. Yeah. So Victor, Teresa, any final questions? We got a few minutes left here.
I've got one. Obviously, we're in a space full of allyship and congenial, thinkers to the story that you're telling. What has been the most aggressive response to this story? Has there been people that didn't like the truth being told as you've told it?
I haven't. Honestly, I've been a little bit shallower on social media. So when we were popping, I was not really looking at a lot of that stuff. I ended up actually having I had one of those moments where people don't read the book moments. And it was somebody that was, that was Lenape. And they were basically like, who's telling our, I think the most aggressive response was like, who's telling our story? Did they actually go and talk to people? And, and we kind of, and it was through a person. And so the person that, that knew us, that had read the book, that was part of our consultation group, was just like, yeah, no, they're cool. Read the book. And that and I was like, I'll send you one for free. Just tell me where it needs to go. Read the book. Right. So I think that was pretty much, and I think it really speaks to that idea of the ownership of the stories and how so often we haven't had ownership. So again, here I am, and I have said in everything that I am, incredibly humble, but definitely not saying in any way that I am representative of Susquehannock or Conestoga peoples. I'm a Pueblo boy from back west. But hopefully this is something that inspires more voices and we see more, I was like, I like to write all these things, but I don't have the time to write. I was like, all these things I mentioned, I was like, I'd love to see more of these. So hopefully it gets there. So that was, I think, probably the most aggressive, and it was really not pointed. It was offline.
Right.
I don't necessarily think we've been, could definitely pick a fight. We've laughed about it and kind of wanted to see somebody pick it up, who was just like, oh, they called them murderers. They were boys, and, and actually take the time to read it. But I was also kind of like, it's a lot of reading. I think people ain't going to do that, just especially folks that really want to pick that kind of a fight. Right. There's so much nuance and context. And it's just kind of by the time they wade through most of it, they'll be like, I'm exhausted. Whatever. Can we go find another comic that has a communist on it? And then we can go after them instead, right?
They don't like onions.
Yeah, exactly. No, because
those are different kinds of tears, yo.
Different kinds of tears, right? So, Yeah, and so I don't think, I mean, yeah, and we've been talking about it. I'll just say, you said allyship. I said, like one of my favorite things, I actually use the term accomplice now. I don't need any more allies. I need accomplices. I need some ride or die folks that are coming in with us, right? So like you're going, like if you're in for the cause, then you're down for the same consequences that I have to face. So allies are folks that will, they're like, yeah, you did something great. And I was like, we need those too, but they'll be like, yay, oh, it's time for me to go home. It's like, all right, an accomplice is going to come in and be like, where do we stash the body? Let's go. And I'm like, that's who I want on my side.
Hashtag we too movement. Like that's what we're looking at.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, that's right. Love it.
Yeah. So Teresa, do you have a final question?
Well, I just wanted to say that we need to be in touch, obviously. But because as the director of the Latinx Comic Arts Festival, there's a lot of overlap, with Latinos, with Latinxes, and of course, in indigenous culture, right? And indigenous roots. And so I love the roots thing and the growth thing, going back to the tortoise. But with the festival coming up in March, I mean, this is something I would love to somehow be able to bring you to Modesto, or have you, I say bring you knowing that we have no money right now, but there are ways, right? So I just think that would be incredible, because we have these cross populations of students who are really starting to explore their own identities and what it means to be part of an agricultural community, and what their parents do, and what it means to explore outside of Modesto but within the valley, and that sort of thing. So I'm like feeling the buzz here, I have to say. I'm feeling that energy, and I want to be an accomplice is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
100%.
That's awesome. Totally.
Yeah, so I would absolutely love that. And I think it'll be a great opportunity. Here's what happened at our last event. So we had to cancel 2020, sad. I'm still traumatized.
So did we? Yep.
Yeah. So our 2019 event, before it was the festival, I was co-directing the expo, the Latino Comics Expo. And it was the first time we'd ever had this event on campus. We'd ever had comics, a Latinx focused event highlighting Latino creators. And the students came out, the community came out, and it wasn't like 12,000 people. It was maybe about 1,500 people, but everybody sold out.
Yeah, we did the same. Exactly. We did the same when we first Indigenous Comic-Con, same thing. We made as much money for folks as going to like any of the major cons. There are people that like had I remember people coming up the first year for us, people were coming up saying that like their cards were getting turned off because they had spent so much money down the line.
That's amazing.
At all these different vendors. And they were like, I gotta go, or people walking out with bags being like, I gotta drop these off at the hotel so I can come back and get more stuff. So yeah, no, I know that story. That's awesome.
I had students coming up to me saying, do you know that I can't afford lunch tomorrow? And then they have all these comics. And I'm like, sorry,
everywhere.
Sorry.
Yeah. I'm like, maybe just keep supporting, find these comics. Exactly. Yep.
So I'm like, I'll buy you
please.
Oh, it's
good.
There you go. Good. Yeah. No, that's when you tell them to like pull their resources and then get pizza for the rest of the week.
That's right. Everybody just save it. There you go.
There it is. I'm curious, what part of North Carolina are you in?
We're right outside of Chapel Hill. So we're just right here in the triangle.
Nice.
On the western edge of the triangle. So
unfortunately, it's 8:30 and it's time to bring this amazing ReggieCon panel to a close. Dr. Lee Francis, thank you so much for coming and chatting with us about this amazing piece of work.
Thank you.
For the rest of you, we'll see you at our next ReggieCon panel on December 2nd at 7 p.m. when we celebrate Seasonal Depression Awareness Month with a discussion of the much-loved, culturally iconic A Charlie Brown Christmas with psychologist David Pincus. So
That
thanks.
was desktop. There we go. We're good.
There you go.
Yeah.
So thanks to all of you for attending. Thanks to everyone behind the scenes for making us look like we know what we're doing. Again, thank you, Lee. Best to all of you. Have a good evening.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.